Hello, everyone.
Oh, this one. Oh, that's true.
Why
Yeah.
are you in it?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for welcoming us with your presence tonight. I'm an LSE fellow in Gender and Human Rights in the Department of Gender Studies at LSE. And tonight, it's an honor for me to chair this event where we are going to delve into the wonderful world of Dr. Charania and her archive of tones. This is a part of the event series celebrated by the 38th year of LSE Gender Studies. Dr. Charania is an associate professor of international studies and comparative human studies at Spelman College. She is a feminist theorist whose research explores the psychosocial dimensions of the lives of women of color. She investigates social, political, and intimate issues in relation to violence and care, gender and sexuality, racism and diasporic experience. She is the author of two books, Archive of Tongues, An Intimate History of Brownness, which was published by Duke University Press in last year, and Will the Real Pakistani Woman Please Stand Up, Empire, by Visual Culture, and Brown Female Body, published by McFarlane in 2015. Dr. Charania is also the recipient of a number of awards and fellowships, including the Anschutz Distinguished Fellowship in American Studies at Princeton University. She was previously a Fulbright Special Appointee, Emrah University Psychoanalytic Society Fellow, as well as a Fellow at Emrah University James Weldon Johnson Institute for the Study of Race and Difference. She is currently beginning a new book project on Brownness and femicide. This evening, Charania's latest book, Archive of Tones, will invite us into the worlds of brown mothers, daughters, aunts, lovers, whose desireful, whimsical, witty, and already politically charged stories, memories, comments, and jokes have constituted a particular way of communicating violence and solidarity across generations and geographies of dislocation. But before we immerse ourselves in this rich discourse, I want to take a minute and talk about how Archive of Tongues stimulated a range of emotions in my world, which was shaped by a relentless Kurdish mother and three sisters who lived much of their feminist life journeys either in a shantytown house or in the textile sweatshops located in the outskirts of Istanbul. Coming from the easternmost part of Turkey to Istanbul without speaking a single word of Turkish, my mother's tongue was a site for her struggle to learn the dominant language, the absence of which certainly meant her exclusion from our neighborhood in Maidenface. Learning Turkish was also important for her to teach the language to my sisters, who would be punished by their teachers for not knowing the Turkish name for baby chicks. Speaking of baby chicks, my mother had established her way of communication with chickens and baby chicks she would raise in our basement and garden. Every day she would wake up and feed them by making lovely jokes to them. When we grew up and got accustomed to the city life, the smell of their nests coming from our window must have disturbed our anxieties with modernity so deeply, we asked my mother to stop taking care of chickens, realizing only years later that we had severely broken her relationships with her friends. Since then, that brokenness remained there in her loneliness. Despite our initiatives to create a new nest for chickens, while she was establishing new emotional bonds with her flowers first, and then with Mexican telenovelas and Indian soap operas.
I'm addicted to those myself.
Reading Charania's book illuminates in me the Kurdish ways of making sense of the world, in which one communicates loss, grief, and intimacy, but also the world of strategies, threats, and mechanisms of silence seeking to tie, tame, and discipline our tongues. For queer Kurds, such a struggle implies a loss of language of desire. one can only think of sex, desire, and intimacy in Kurdish language as mockery. In many parts of the world, those who speak out against patriarchy are threatened to have their tongues cut, limbs sewn, or mouths closed. One's use of tongues is the sign of danger, and also a desire not only for diverting or disorienting oppression, but also for making life livable and laughable. It's often through the choreography of the tongue's lonely but elastic nature you have mentioned in the end of the book, with witty jokes and stories that sit there for generations. Finally, I would like to take this opportunity to invite all of us to speak out against the mass human destruction occurring in Gaza and to honor the remarkable resilience and solidarity demonstrated by Palestinians and others in the region and around the world. Our event will now start with Dr. Charania talk for 45 or 50 minutes. Then we will continue with the Q&A discussion for like 30 minutes. In an event of emergency, you can use the stairs, but not lifts. They won't work. Yeah, thank you, SM and Violet, to make this happen. For those who need special assistance, Violet and I will be waiting for you to assist you in times of emergency. And without further delay, let us commence this journey together, guided by the wisdom, intellectual depth, and imagination of Dr. Moon Charania. Please join me in extending warm welcome to Moon as she shares her insights on this remarkable work.
Thank you. I'm going to stand. I've actually prepared some remarks, but let me begin by saying how absolutely delighted I am to be invited to the Gender Studies Institute at the London School of Economics. My warmest gratitude to SM and Violet for coordinating this event, and to Emrah for joining me as a discussant and really as a co-thinker. So I'm really grateful for that, and it's really an honor to be here. So this evening, I hope to share with you the theoretical, conceptual, and methodological questions that guided my writing, and to give you a sense of the arc and the stakes of Archive of Tongues and Intimate History and Brownness. In part, this means that I hope to share the various bodies of theory that are being brought to bear in the book: women of color feminisms, queer of color thought, psychoanalysis, and decolonial studies, even as the book does not labor under the sign of any master signifier. Instead, I want to ask and perhaps answer why an archive of tongues matter. How might we theorize an archive of racialized maternal flesh? How has the racialized maternal been left behind in the annals of critical theory, including certain strands of postcolonial studies, feminist studies, and queer studies? How might the brown mother's tongue expose a whole world where aspirations of the good life are cast aside for the everyday necropolitical? And this is certainly what we're seeing right now, perhaps more than ever. Feminist political philosopher Joy James once wrote, "There are privileged maternals and there are hunted maternals." It is worth adding here that there too are haunted maternals, or perhaps the hunted become the haunted. My book, Archive of Tongues, An Intimate History of Brownness, is my intercourse with this haunting, with my ghost, with my mother. Indeed, haunting is both a major incumbent of the book and a sleight of hand. But to be sure, my investigation is not one of an atomized brown mother, an insular Oedipal narrative of desire. It is instead a serious investigation of brownness through the provocation of the maternal. The effacing of the brown maternal and the abject maternal body are driving vexations in this book. In the book, I offer intimate autopsies of brown maternal experiences, including illegal abortion, corrosive sexual objectification and violence, disability, injury, illness, brokenness, slow life, fast death, and the varying states of losing one's speech, one's tongue. And as Emrah noted, in addition to all of that really depressing stuff, I also offer dirty jokes and a kind of lyricism that I think women like my mother's a poetics, if you will, a litany, a repetition that allowed them to make sense of a world not of their own making. So what I'm going to do is, just in terms of a more structure, is to read sections of two sections of the introduction, one of which is an opening story on tongues and thus inspired the title, and another section is more kind of what we might consider theory and methods, if indeed the book has theory and methods in any traditional hegemonic sense of the phrase. And then I'm hoping I will sit with Emrah, and there are some sections that he highlighted that perhaps we can read out loud that might generate some interesting discussion. When I was a little girl, my mother used to tell me a story. Like many of my mother's stories, this story was abject and centered around flesh. And for a long time, I thought the story was yet another example of my mother's obsession with oppression. But my mother narrated the story with such mysteriousness, seriousness, with such dailiness, continuity, factuality, steadiness, that I eventually came to hold space for this story in my life, that I eventually realized that my growing was marked by this story. The story was about the tongue. Think about the human tongue, my mother would say. The tongue is soft and vulnerable, fleshy and pink. We need it to eat, to speak. We need it to enjoy food. We need it to enjoy sex. The tongue is all muscle, no bone, supple. It has a huge range of motion and shape and agility. The tongue, she would say, is tirelessly flexible. But this tongue, for all its softness, lives between 32 teeth, hard, strong, dense, and sharp. Any given second, the teeth can damage, tear, wound the tongue. But the tongue has no choice. It must learn to live among the teeth, between and within the hardness that could individually or collectively destroy it. My mother does not remember the origins of this story, unsure if it came from her mother or her grandmother, or a story she strung together from other stories she had heard throughout her life. But every time she offered this story, it was an invitation to think about precarity and violence and unlivability, to think with her about the ways that women are often, as Simone de Beauvoir wrote, imprisoned by the peculiarities of the body, to think with her about the messy, discursive, paratactic ways both power, structural, and pleasure, libidinal, are bound up together. The very idea of the tongue living so intimately with that which can destroy it functions as a metaphor not just of death, but of death worlds, a metaphor of a life that is perpetually threatened with or close to death. But just as she inextricably enmeshed the tongue in a field of imminent violences, her story also pointed to the ways the tongue ruptures these possibilities and is instead perpetually surviving, resisting, maneuvering, negotiating, and fleeing its oppressive conditions. For as long as I can remember, my mother constructed the tongue in this way, as experimental, always tentative, subversive, possibly subordinate, and unsovereign, never belonging just to itself. This private, metaphoric story of the tongue's place in the mouth, among teeth, was one moment when I realized that my mother speaks in tongues. As the primer of my childhood, I now take this story into serious consideration as an object of theory, as an episteme in formation. This strange little story, a play on words, a play on tongues, holds within it what Shayla Sandoval might call a methodology of the oppressed, an alternative consciousness and oppositional expression. I came to see my mother's tongue as a relation to a condition, a maneuvered sociality, a denied pedagogy. It is a pedagogy that is not pedagogical because it is rife with bad education, feminine insurgency, and indices of failure. It is a pedagogy of how to exist once you accept that oppression is immovable, a social fact of social life. It is a pedagogy that refuses to do what language in its more colonial guises is often called upon to do. It is a pedagogy that renders oppression, allegorized through the fleshy pink tongue among hard teeth, carnal, sexual, arbitrary, ideological, and quotidian. For my mother, as I hope might be clear by the story, tongues are a thingness that is feminized. They're fleshy and vulnerable, even as they're agile and manipulative, just as they too perform a way of being within the mouth and without language. The tongue is given meaning, even saturated with meaning, just as it too is dismissed as meaning nothing. It is the ideological and fleshy site from which one must be severed in order for one to become a subject, the mother in the tongue, or the mother tongue. And I'll speak more on this in the second section. That language gets collapsed into tongues and tongues into language is not entirely figurative. It literally invokes the maternal body. As a deeply erotic, intimate, tenuous apparition, the tongue, like women's bodies, is often regarded as dirty and excessive, particularly in terms of sexuality. My mother's story assembles and fissures this dirty, irreverent, and fugitive femininity, and in so doing gestures to queer sexuality, to dirty sex, to a too literal and an appropriately oblique relation to the libidinous. It captures and stays close to immodesty and eroticism, sensation and feeling, language and flesh. In feminizing the tongue, soft flesh surrounded by hardness, my mother signals to femininity as one way into other knowledges, memories, socialities, and stories. Tongues as object also deliberately obscures the subject-object dialectic central to critical theory, and this obfuscation, this feminist, maybe even feminine, smokescreen was key to developing what I came to understand as an ars erotic critical method, an ethics and a poetic that allowed me to grasp at what so many saw as the irrational forces at work in my mother and other brown mothers, the scattered, fragmented, splintering, disorganized, repetitive thoughts and lexicons that couldn't be made coherent to scholarly interpretation. Trinh Minh Ha once wrote that the mark of a mother's talk is a practice of indiscretion that is at times overt and at times secret. I think of how this story about the tongue marks Minh Ha's point, a story that seems to state the obvious, just as it too reveals a secret way of thinking. In this way, then, I think of tongues as alluding to secrets, memories, inheritances, metaphors, and opacities in Brown Mother's way of explaining the world. Riddled with riddles and moving with metaphor, my mother's stories often confounded me, puzzled me, frustrated me. I searched and searched for what was important about her metaphors over and above candor, what was important about her opacities over and above transparencies. Metaphors for my mother are serious things. It is fundamentally how she speaks. So are archives. But the conventional archive, that which evidences the past or past events through text, documents, materials, was not one with which my mother would have engaged, or for that matter, understood, in part because of the dialectic between access and knowledge or knowledge production, what in Urdu is called talim, but in part, and perhaps more frankly, because she would find it boring. While others built their knowledge by collecting information through rational and regularized processes, my mother, in contrast, pursued means that were oral, irregular, inappropriate, improper, embarrassing, even shameful. She did it sometimes surreptitiously, other times boldly, and other times ordinarily, like cooking, like telling stories. It looked like complacency and cliche and acceptance to the dominant order. I learned to listen closely to what she had to offer me, and I found myself deeply enmeshed in flesh, thick with fissured, fragmented, polyvocal, dirty, feminized, maternal vernaculars. The tongue of which my mother speaks and the tongues through which I now write this book are an archive of a feminized world that has been made abject and violated, or just not evaded, or just not dealt with, misogynistically dismissed or reduced to myth, folklore, old wives' tales, illiteracy, gossip, riddles, conspiracy theories, and secrets. I am now a collector and curator of my mother's tongues, perhaps retrospectively, perhaps nostalgically. So that's one opening section that I've really abbreviated and kind of pulled out pieces that I hope gives you a sense of what the book is trying to do and why this might be important to feminist studies. So I'll turn now to another section of the book. I am reading from my computer, but this is all actually in the book. But it's easier. I don't have to put my glasses on. So I'm going to now jump to another section of the book, which is a real deep dive into psychoanalysis. So bear with me. We all have, I think most of us have what we might call just a hate-hate relationship with psychoanalysis. And, I'll just say, I flirted with psychoanalysis for years, probably a decade, and I finally, with this book, just got into bed with it. And you'll see the results of that. So, okay. But the fact remains that to raise the specter of the brown mother means turning slightly, if not fully, towards psychoanalysis, despite psychoanalysis's own dismissal, disavowal, and detestation of mothers. I turn to psychoanalysis because, as Avery Gordon has written, this is where the human sciences have been most willing to entertain ghosts. But to posit the brown, immigrant, domesticated mother as a central figure through whom we might think of and access knowledge or knowledge production, to actually do this thing we name decolonizing knowledge, requires first trekking, if briefly, through the deep historical disavowal of the mother in the Western theoretical canon, with psychoanalysis as mea culpa. When Giles Deleuze wrote, "It is not my language that is maternal, it is my mother who is a language," his words weren't necessarily about his mother, or for that matter, about mothers at all. Deleuze referred to the mother as a collection of words that have been put in his mouth and ears, the mother as a metaphysical, metaphorical, disembodied organizing entity, what Deleuze would refer to as life, although this was life as abstraction and not life as flesh. The figure of the father, conversely, is foreign, that which is accessed exteriorly, hence knowledge. So Deleuze, like many others, betrays the figure of the mother in order to get at what he names philosophy or knowledge. And Deleuze was one of the few theorists who actually liked his mother. In psychoanalysis, language is the name of the father, achieved through a necessary and productive rejection of the desire-producing mother. Lacan tells us that the mother has to be learned as the other in the mother, in order for the self to emerge. This separation is fundamentally subject formation for Lacan, in that this refusal of the mother creates the conditions of the Cartesian split, a split we know is an impossibility in the patriarchal, orientalist, and colonial context. Lacan, of course, also noted that we learn language, loss, and desire at the same time. In order to enter language, we must be severed from the immediacies of bodily satisfaction. For psychoanalysts, it is exhaustingly always about the mother's breast. Lacan, along with the familiar cast of characters of Freud, Marx, Derrida, and others, want to forget the mother. And they all do so in particularly dull, reductive, and self-congratulatory misogynistic ways. In Capital, Marx argued that ideas have to be translated out of their mother tongue and into a foreign language in order to circulate, be exchangeable. Freud, of course, totally pathologized the mother and saw her as a repressive force. Derrida, unsurprisingly, named philosophy itself as masculine, so that the philosopher is always a paternal figure. Thus, the deconstruction of the phallogocentric is a deconstruction of philosophy itself, even as he, too, could not imagine a thinking, much less philosophizing mother. We might also consider the 17th century painter Francois Perrier, for whom feminine sexuality takes refuge in motherhood to live out its perversions and madness. You can see how much these men love their mothers. From Freud's self-analysis to Sartre's psychobiography to Alain Badiou's disdainful maternal narratives, we see the Anglo-European abjection of the maternal. And lest we forget, this abject mother with her overfeeding breast and overbearing tongue is a white mother. Even Donald Winnicott's good enough mother, developed some 20 years after Freud, as a white mother. The white maternal rises and recedes within the archives of theory, repressed or loathed, foreclosed or displaced. Indeed, it would not be a stretch to say that the mother of color and her tongue are unthinkable within their epistemological frames. If these dead white men could speak, they would be hard-pressed to allow a black or brown mother to pass through their tongues, except, of course, when they might be feeding off of her breast. But psychoanalytic feminists looking into the archive, the few that chose to do so, couldn't quite resuscitate her either. Nancy Chodorow, for example, showed that traditional psychoanalysis failed the mother by positing that motherhood is body and fatherhood is mind, a dichotomy that inevitably and pathologically produced the sexual division of labor. However, Chodorow, even as she opened a space to understand the unending and embodied maternal labor, essentialized maternity as white and the subsequent gender division of labor as universal and evenly experienced, which we know a number of scholars have made a number of interventions here. Angela Davis, for example. Melanie Klein notably shifted the focus from the mother as fanatical figure from which the child must separate to the obsessive fantasies the infant has of the mother, the fanatical and even destructive child. Klein reversed the pathological claim that it is the mother who obsesses over her attachment to the infant, and in so doing initiated what we might think of as a mother-centered psychoanalysis. but Klein's construction of the good breast, bad breast object, Kleinian object relations theory, and the sadistic infant who wants to consume, perhaps even destroy the mother, meant that Kleinian psychoanalysis dwelled in psychic drives, thus eventually moving away from the mother altogether. And it might be worth noting that Klein had very estranged relations with all three of her children, particularly her daughter, who too was a psychoanalyst. But perhaps the most masterful subversion in psychoanalysis is made by Julia Kristeva, even as she acknowledged that even speaking of the mother sets one up to be, quote, accused of normativism, red regression. Kristeva was highly critical of the paternal tongue, which is influence and logic and social order as we know it. She argued prolifically against Freud and Lacan, taking the position that entry into language is not the result of lack or separation, but is motivated by pleasure and excess, indeed the body's own longing, its own urge to speak. Building a case for maternal passion, Kristeva writes that the child develops language with the mother, not through or against her. She further argues that Winnicott's good enough mother involved a depassioning that transforms the fear of monstrosity mothering or mothering monstrosity, the over-mothering mother, into that which is misread as serenity or just enough. The over-mothering mother that Kristeva pushes against whom Winnicott developed the good enough mother, bear with me here, often directly or indirectly involve the specific dynamic of the mother-daughter relationship. The mother-daughter dyad is always and already too close for comfort, thus most available for psychoanalytic critique, is the unfortunate clutch on which Kristeva leans. For all her feminist genius, Kristeva implies that the underbelly of maternal passion is narcissism, the effect of which can be a psychically dangerous symbiotic fusion between the mother and her daughter. At that same moment of feminist psychoanalysis, Luce Irigaray conversely recognized the mother-daughter relation as one that is disrupted by patriarchy. She observed and argued, not incorrectly, that, and I quote, Western culture is founded not on the much-feared patricide on which the Oedipal complex lies, but rather on the more common murder of the mother. Her radical thesis that the culture we live in and the myths we live by are predicated on the death of the mother as subject and the subsequent erasure of what she refers to as maternal genealogy is important to how I think about the maternal body. However, despite her important, sometimes radical, sometimes romantic intervention, Irigaray saw the mother, perhaps inevitably under the conditions of patriarchy, as a suffocating figure, particularly towards the daughter. In one doesn't stir without the other, and this is one of Irigaray's canonical works. One of the most salient sensations that emerge from reading Irigaray is that of the glut of the mother, overfeeding and overstuffing her daughter, which is what demands then a flight to the father or a third abstraction, i.e. knowledge. Even feminists not attached to rewriting the psychoanalytic script fell into this trope. Judith Butler, for example, recognized the mother as the original site of desire. But for Butler, desire for the mother and motherhood is laced with melancholy, taboo, and by the compulsory obligation to only reproduce. Simone de Beauvoir's memoir on her mother, A Very Easy Death, expresses the ideological distance a feminist daughter must have or has to have with her mother. Even contemporary postcolonial feminists and white queer scholars, resuscitated this narrative of the failed mother from whom we must depart or with whom we cannot yet contend, recalling here the otherwise lovely and powerful works of Sarah Suleri in Meatless Days, Manju Kapoor, Difficult Daughters, Kathy Hong, Minor Feelings, and Jordi Rosenberg's Daddy Dialectic. In all these epistemic framings, we see the carte blanche impulse to forget the mother, where forgetting the mother is the sine qua non of individuation. What is more, while these feminists disputed the psychoanalytic privileging of the male infant, rewrote the pathological over-nursing mother as a byproduct of patriarchy, and in some small ways gave language back to the mother, they were all speaking, if not literally, then ideologically, about white middle-class motherhood, or its ascendant. Even in Of Women Born, where Adrienne Rich wrote, we know more about the air we breathe, the seas we travel, than about the nature and meaning of motherhood. She, like her feminist comrades, was holding space for a white mother. Indeed, I would say that in all of these feminist resuscitations, there is a way in which white and white adjacent mothers, despite whatever wound they may carry, are always positioned in the space of life, a space from which Black and brown mothers are evacuated. In writing about my mother, I want to disrupt this homology of whiteness and motherhood, and this homology of the maternal as failure, pathology, forgettable, or just good enough. Certainly the collective history and theorizing of Black women put them in a different relationship to the canonical categories of the Freudian paradigm, that is, to the father, to the maternal, and to femininity. The history of slavery produced a very polarized approach to the maternal, either the maternal as absence, dearth, negation, and neglect, red black, or the plenitude of the maternal, the idealization of maternal love and care, red white. This colonial binary erased the complex experiences of ambivalence, survival, and politics that shape colonized mothering for Black and brown mothers and its attendant grammars of loss and abjection. For Hortense Spillers, merely thinking of the Black mother marks an epistemological limit in psychoanalysis, and thus Spillers bends psychoanalysis towards a consideration of the Black mother. Spillers points out that the processes of violent enfleshment of Black bodies denied the possibility for the symbolic, thus protective gender identity, allocated only for white women and mothers. And this symbolic gender identity was also accompanied by the violent erasure of Black mothers and Black mothering. Under colonial conditions, the Black maternal became synonymous with absence. Mother dispossessed was Spiller's phrase. The Black maternal as a container of social hatred. Emrah Jamila Musser offers too a lacerating and important intervention here, arguing that the psychoanalytic turning away from the maternal and the feminine is itself a byproduct of patriarchal coloniality. Musser takes the position that if the conditions of disappearance, violence, and the severing of the mother tie are the result of global capitalism and its violent machinations of moving bodies, destroying kin, and exploiting labor, then the brown mother too has been disappeared. Musser points out that these conditions of brown maternity introduce melancholy into the maternal dynamic, not only through the psychoanalytic foreclosure of the mother that Kristeva and others argue, which is still the white mother, but also because the Black and brown mother is doubly repressed, first by psychoanalytic maneuvers, which dismiss or disavow her, and then two, by conditions of global capitalism, which reduce her to fleshy excess, which is nonetheless possessed. So this bending, twisting, and turning of feminist and psychoanalytic perspectives towards the racial maternal subtend with my two key signs, my mother and her tongues. I position my mother in this chain of unprivileged subjects as both an overdetermined and disappeared figure. I think of how my mother's tongues enact, release, and contain the tensions of psychoanalytic theories, even as her speaking in tongues is a key site of psychoanalytic failure. Her polysemic and intertextual stories underscore what Jacqueline Rose called the yet unsettled relations between feminism, psychoanalysis, and affect studies. Thus, while I understand that in the psychoanalytic telos, the maternal is a container of discomfort and anxiety and conflict, which is to say so too is the feminine, I too am drawn to the psychoanalytic conviction that one keeps one's deepest self from oneself. Psychoanalysis argument, the blindness of the seeing eye, and this is Freud's phrase in Studies in Hysteria, suggests that the unknown thrives in the unconscious and is thus one way to get at the troubled air of our secrets, those that govern us and those we are not really aware of as a philosophical enterprise. Thus, I see my brown mother and her tongue as this site of ludic, dislocating, interstitial, deterritorializing, an assemblage that operates against Oedipal logics that constrain maternal life towards discipline and dispossession. My mother has an abject tongue. She is what I would call obsessed with oppression. In a strange way, oppression and abjection were as much tantalizing distraction as they were ordinary and bodily and bare life. Her tongues reveal not extreme life, but ordinary life in its affective cathexis. But just as her articulation of this abjection was part of her everyday, so too was the marking of her speech as improper, as made up, as impossible to hear or to not have happened, or uncouth, lowbrow, tawdry. Hers was a tongue of excess, a portal to a past to which no one wanted to return, and many did not think existed. But my mother was obsessed with this excess, and she was obsessed with surrendering to it. It was through this obsession that she created a temporality of melancholic motherhood, an archival fixation with the past. Hers was a tilted gaze, rather than the God's eye view that fucks with the world, a mother's eye view that understands the feminine and the mother is fucked in and by the world. Her relation to this dispossession is something she and I, through her and with her, have been processing for a lifetime, yet our processing is inadequate. The gestures of deconstruction in which I have been trained are afflicted with failure. Her testimony falls outside the official, her witnessing outside the rationale, her stories outside the documented, her memory insufficient, subjective, feminized, racialized. A dark cloud of illegitimacy was cast on my mother's stories. I orient myself towards this dark cloud, this brown tongue, this maternal archive, with its many dirty abimes, its accidental nuances, its casual violence, its indeterminate analyses, and its arbitrary tenderness. I have, as Derrida might say, archive fever. Abjection is my mother's archival fixation. Her archive is peopled with brown women, brown girls, and brown mothers. Men and boys are ancillary, even as they are necessary, even as she relied on them, even as she bore them. Hers was an archive voluptuously overflowing with unusual inhabitants, strange sayings, violent stories, dirty jokes, random tenderness, debris, and dirt. Her memories cohere around objects unpredictably in ways that are fragmented and shaped by the logics of the unconscious. Nostalgia, personal memory, pain, and trauma are the constitutive elements that make up her stories, all partial and somewhat destroyed. I think about what it means to take up these pieces without seeking out something authentic and complete, without needing to restore the fragments into a credible form. If culture is a litany of affective activity that isn't always legible to normative, intelligible codes, then, as my mother described it, her intimate, familial, national, class, gender, ethno-religious culture was within and outside of feminine excess, of that which had been recorded, ritualized, and reckoned with. The collision of these poles filled in her real and imagined life story, assembling and reassembling, each moving across and through borders in ways both familiar and strange. In this way, my mother's memories were literally hard to grasp, slippery, vague, amorphous, embodied, even if in rare moments, specific, factual, researchable. But without her memory, what is it I would call my culture? What is it I would call my brownness? The split subject that psychoanalysis posits was profoundly manifest in our conversations. While others moved in the fast-paced technological world, my mother stayed in her idiosyncratic, quasi-allegorical, slow, spread-out world. Being with my mother meant I had to come to embody her kind of sociality of slowness in the midst of my otherwise frenzied life. Her stories demanded a different temporality. One has to slow down for the imagery, the elusive clusters, the dense affect. In so many of our conversations, my mother repeated stories over and over again, asking, also over and over, did I ever tell you this? Repetition, memory loss, and random epiphanies shaped our conversation. My mother deployed feminine vernaculars that were out of time, linguistic lyricism that disrupted Anglophone and androcentric assumptions, lexical intimacies that arrested meaning, delving sometimes deeper and downward into the underbelly, and at other times moving upward, vertically, diagonally. Sometimes the stories didn't change, and at other times, significant details would change. An uncle would turn into a brother, a father into a grandfather. Dhaka would change to Chittagong, London to Atlanta. The weight of memory bearing down, breaking holes, totalities into remains. And sometimes, not always, a second, third, or fourth retelling revealed a previously unspoken dynamic, fact, or emotion. Repetition for repetition's sake, repetition for revelation's sake. And I'll just add here that repetition, unsurprisingly, is a maligned form of memory in psychoanalysis. Shocking. Okay, back to the text. I had to learn to read my mother's stories, as Deborah Britzman once says of a slow reading, a scene within a scene within a scene, or what Heather Love names not merely close, but too close, claustrophobic, even abject. but her fragmentariness presented a formidable challenge, indicative of an encounter that couldn't be assimilated into our modern immigrant family, a refusal to submit to dominant logics. I had to learn to write in tongues as she spoke in tongues. And truth be told, again and again, my conversations with my mother were interrupted by a break, by real ruptures, by exterior forces. The interruptions were themselves new ideas, which decentered sometimes and confirmed at other times what my mother's tongue was offering. Here was another metaphor for theoretical work as domestic interruption. The interruption of life, illness, children, cooking, family, housework, emotional management, time itself, was specific and decisive, sometimes cruel, sometimes banal. But there were other interruptions, of stories within stories, of secrets and metaphors that snuck up on her and on me, of gazes met and lips sealed, of knowledge-making within the work of homemaking. It was ruptural. It reorganized her and me and the space between us in concrete ways. The change had consequences. My object, her tongue, changed in those moments, requiring both of us to reassemble, shift, bite down, or let go. So when Derrida wrote that the mother tongue, even when inhabited, is uninhabitable, or when Andre Green writes that nothing can represent the maternal object, I respond by taking the position that language achieved through a separation from the mother is an accretion of lies. I respond by saying that my mother's tongues linger with the haunting feminist and queer desire to name the mother, to foreground the deep, intense desire for intimacy with the mother that gets replaced in the modern world for successful subjectification. The dialectical oscillation between the tongue as flesh from which we must depart or which we can never inhabit, represent, or embody, and the tongue as language, subject formation, echoes the way the term itself is in a weird space of indeterminacy, where it is neither fully of body nor fully of self. I have stakes in this indeterminacy, this dizzying circuitousness. It takes me where I would otherwise not go. It takes me in, down, and through feminized, fleshy, maternal brownness. It takes me in, down, and through the remains, traces, and vestiges of the maternal element in one's tongue, the many mutable, excessive, and uncontainable tongues in my mouth and in hers. It takes me in, down, and through likable and unlikable brown mothers, good and difficult brown daughters. It takes me in, down, and through the limits of what can be uttered as queer, where queerness is informed by its historical specificity of sexual irregularities, where queerness liquefies all the stories we have of maternity, of family, of learning to love and to lust, where queerness shears normativity, where queerness is bodily and that which challenges the limits of what can be understood as a desirable body, where queerness is often vilified as cowardly or dirty, where queerness assumes the presence of queer desire despite the silence, where queerness names something of the uncapturable or unpredictable trajectory of an erotic life, and where queerness refuses the hegemonic disassociation from the mother, the feminine and the femme, and instead lingers with and makes love to the eggs, the breast, the vulvas, and the tongues of the mother. Thank you.
We have 10 minutes. Would you like to read us a short excerpt from that specific sections on four speech acts that I was really fond of? One of you choosing.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Can everyone hear me? Yes?
Yeah.
No? Okay. So one of the conversations Emrah and I had before we began was the chapter he found compelling, and thank you, is chapter 4. The title is called Promiscuous Tongues. And what I really wanted to think about in that chapter is how to get at my mother's sex life. And just really the sexuality and the eroticism of my mother and mothers that I grew up with, without, and as a good Foucauldian, I wanted to avoid the confessing, model. I think what I realized in the writing of this book is that the way to get at sex was through language. the way to get at eroticism was through metaphor. And so this particular chapter moves through 4 speech acts that allow me to kind of think about the erotic life of my mother. So there's one that is actually a dirty joke, but it's also, perhaps I should give a trigger warning, but there's also another section. We'll see how much time we have, maybe? All right, so I'll start with a joke. Are we okay with that? Okay. It seems mature enough audience, you know, they're small babies. All right, okay. So this is one of the speech acts. There's a joke that circulated among the women in my family. It was recited often over tea and food, in bedrooms where the women sat in long maxi nighties, in living rooms where they thought nobody was listening, at weddings, engagements, baby showers, dinner parties, Eid parties, and even inside the prayer hall of the mosque. There were actually many jokes, many if not all, dirty jokes, that had the women wildly laughing, wiping tears from their eyes as they continued cackling, and joyfully high-fiving one another. One after the other, the women would share these jokes, each one more satisfying than the previous. But there was one that was a group favorite. It goes something like this. A young man returns to his small rural town from the big city to marry. He wants to marry an innocent virgin girl, he says, since all the city girls are loose and promiscuous. To his delight, his marriage is quickly and smoothly arranged with a young woman, doe-eyed, fair-skinned, virginal. On their wedding night, the young man, excited to teach his innocent wife the activity of sex, pulls out his penis and asks her, "What do you think this is?" Now, mind you, the joke is in Urdu, so there's obviously the limits of translation. Okay, so what do you think this is? The young wife takes a long look and responds in a song-like, innocent voice, that is a mouse. Any Urdu speakers in here? Urdu, Hindi, few? So the line, the refrain of the joke is, "Ye to chua hai." Okay. And it's very sing-song, Bollywood style, imagine it. Okay. So she says that is a mouse. The young groom laughs at her innocence, correcting her gently. No, darling, this is called a penis. The bride again looks at his penis and responds, no, that's a mouse. Agitated but still gentle, the groom repeats, no, sweetheart, this is my penis. But the young bride keeps repeating, sing-song, childlike, that is a mouse, ye to chua hai. Finally, the groom, frustrated at his bride's refusal to respond to his arousal and her childlike sing-song reference to his penis as a mouse, demands to know why she insists on this reference. The virginal bride responds, what my uncle had was a penis, yours is a mouse. So, yeah. I'll just read maybe a bit more, and then we'll stop. So this also speaks to the laughter in the room, or the contained laughter, the repressed laughter. It was much later in life that I learned not to repeat this joke to feminist crowds. When I recounted this joke to select feminist and queer friends, they would curiously follow the body of the joke, only to look at me humorlessly at the punchline, often with a disapproving nod or look of disgust. The joke's condensation and displacement, its implications and obscene underbelly, its use of metaphor and metonymy, its entire machinery, was not meant for particular audiences. In the hierarchy of speech genres, a joke certainly holds a low place, and a joke like this, even lower. It might be worth turning to Freud and his treatise on jokes, specifically the dirty joke and its many double entendres. But Freud, regardless of his provocative discussion on the processes of humor, never had female laughers in mind. So what was it about this joke that had these brown mothers, and indeed it was the mothers and not the young, unmarried or newly married aunts or older cousins, falling over in pleasure, a pleasure that could not be replicated in other audiences? So I move actually in a kind of analysis of the joke, but what I really wanted to think about with this joke is, what it meant for women to own the terms of laughter, which I think is very different when women, particularly women of color, who are very accustomed to being the butt of jokes, particularly in the context of sexual violence. And so what it meant for these women to actually take this particular joke and own the laughter, and what was the slapstick sexuality, what was happening. I think the joke also, which I would, without reading, just to kind of think about it, and we can have this conversation as well, is how it really has the effect, it has a kind of castrating effect on the husband, but also more broadly on masculinity. So that's one section. Perhaps I'll read one more. Do we have time? Are we okay? How tired?
We have just 5 minutes. Maybe I can ask a question
Oh yeah,
to comment
absolutely.
on the
Yeah.
other sections. I feel impressed by your sensibility to approach those comments made by your mom or the experiences that your relatives had in terms of how those risky behaviors, but by risky I mean like those behaviors or statements that would not be appreciated by mainstream, even radical feminists in the West, from like your comments to about gay rights from your mother, or the act of stealing women made in order to have their own kinds of like substance. Could you comment on those kinds of like connections that you have built through these archives that allow you to have this kind of sensibility that most of our scholarship have not actually given attention?
Yeah, thank you for that, Emrah. I appreciate the question. Just to provide a bit of background, 2 sections that Emrah is referring to. One is a comment, a story that I tell where my mother tells my partner, who's white, butch, Southern, before we were heading to Islamabad for a trip, to not be the gay while we are there. And this was the kind of language, this was exactly the phrase. So it was a kind of thinking about the article, that precedes gay, and what that actually does to the language, which one can see is just a kind of fumble, or a kind of just a broken English. And actually what happens when we take that kind of broken English and what is it doing epistemologically, ontologically to the language? And what had happened in that context is my mother says this to myself and my partner. I repeat this in the evening to my group. We had a family get together, all of us cousins. I repeat it, and this comment by my mother becomes the laughing, that becomes the comedy for the night, basically. All of us like very sophisticated, cosmopolitan, members of the brown diaspora, just laughing hysterically at this kind of broken English of the brown mother. And how in that moment of laughter, what I realized, and really what stopped me dead in my tracks, it was still in the context of writing this book, was that in this moment, that among the, kind of brown, if you will, loosely elite diaspora, that my mother was more of a queer figure than my gay lover traveling in Islamabad. And how to understand that kind of queerness that's embedded in brown maternal speech, particularly when it's seen in this context. Another reference that Emrah is making to is another speech act that emerges in the chapter Promiscuous Tongue, is a phrase I grew up with, the mother of a daughter is always a thief. And this was something that was said to my mother when she had her first daughter, also when in the 1970s, then when she had me, and then when I had my daughter, my mother said this to me in the hospital. So it's a kind of speech act that's traveled across generations, that is a kind of maternally endorsed theft that forces a kind of unpacking of what is considered property, rightful property, and what is considered theft. And these are women who are not working in the formal economy, so just to give that, when I say that they're domesticated women, I mean they're domestic and domesticated, that this is an active kind of containment of these women who do not participate in the formal economy are completely dependent on what we might call masculine or phallic economies, often through their husbands or prior to that through their fathers. So I wanted to think about, again, both of these are kind of what we would call, these incoherent, irrational, illegible, illegitimate kinds of ways of understanding the world. Don't be the gay. Mother of a daughter is always a thief. This kind of, really hysterical pleasure being derived from what is fundamentally a rape joke. We can assume, I think, fairly safely that the conditions of sex between the young bride and her uncle were not consensual. It's a fairly safe assumption. So, but this was something, so you have the ways of these linguistic moments, I think, that really, that I wanted to think about. I wanted to think about an archive that demanded close, claustrophobic engagement with what I considered feminine, brown feminine vernaculars and brown feminine ways of understanding the world, much of which wasn't articulated in co-ed spaces. This is, I think, another aspect of some of these stories. These were not jokes that were told, among multi-gender groups at all. These were jokes that were told among women, between women, when women thought, at least, they were alone. Including many of the kind of advice or idioms that were given from mother to daughter. So,
thank you so much for this wonderful response. I think we can turn the room for questions, comments.
Both the mics are dead, so how does everyone feel about enunciating? You have a question? If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself first and then get right to the question.
Sure. So I'm Anne Pollock from King's College London across the street, and I haven't had a chance to read the book yet, and I am now just very eager to do so. And I wondered from your presentation today, if you could say something more about tense. So I noticed sometimes you said my mother is, and sometimes you said my mother was.
yeah.
And I wonder if you can if you could say more about how you're positing the kind of historicity of the account that you're telling.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Anne, for that question. Anne and I also know each other back from Atlanta days, so it's really nice to see you. But yeah, it's interesting because when I finished the book and I had to do all of my copy editing, I thought, oh my God, all my tenses are all fucked up. Sometimes I'm using it, sometimes I'm using was, and it depended on when it, in some cases it made sense to think about when I say in 2016 my mother, used a particular phrase. But yeah, I think, part of what I wanted to really think about in the book, which I think queers tense or even time, is inheritance. And I think to think about language as that which we inherit is also about thinking about inheritance as being, one has to be willing to receive what one inherits. So inheritance is also a relation of reciprocity. And so that really kind of moved how the tense, whether or not I was speaking, my mother is still alive. So that I think maybe clarifies the kind of movement that, when in particular context, to speak about my words that were said, linguistic phrases, lexical intimacies, as something that was exchanged that is no longer, versus how we might think about the now. And what I think is, another thing I'll say about time is, my mother, and I say this earlier, is that she has a fixation with the past, and that fixation shapes the kind of tense of the tense and the temporality of the text as well. Is how do I think about what she was fixated with as I'm writing, for example, the first chapter really traces what we might call, it has a feeling of a memoir, because I moved through my mother's life until the point where she gets married and her migration to the US. So Karachi to London to Atlanta. So there is a kind of deep kind of memoir-ish writing where you're writing about things that did happen, a kind of almost like a biodata, right? The biographical. But then as we move into these kind of speech acts, these are things that are still circulating very much. And so that changed the way I had to write those stories. But I do think that inheritance becomes one way, because, you know, my mother didn't necessarily make up these linguistic phrases, right? These are deeply inherited ways of speaking and thinking and of knowing the world. These are epistemological frames that are handed down, even as they're seen as not epistemological or even anti-epistemological. So, I'm not sure if I answered. Yeah. Thank you for that question.
Thank you so much for coming, Moon, and for introducing your book to us. I'm still sitting with the rape joke. So I wanted...
Sorry for that.
No, here we are. I wanted to actually ask you to maybe answer a question that I think you were posing, but I felt I didn't receive the answer. So I want to ask, you know, what does it mean for brown women to enjoy a rape joke on their own terms, right? And so kind of thinking through that, what you said about being the butt of a joke versus then, you know, what is that? And I guess I wanted to ask that in relationship to the analogy that you made at the beginning around, you know, the woman as tongue, surviving the teeth and making space within teeth, and, you know, kind of understanding this kind of dualism, I think, that you were setting up then. How do you, or do you relate that to the, you know, to the tongue, teeth?
Yeah, no, thank you, Assam, for that. And I appreciate that kind of return to the fleshy tongue among teeth as a way to open up an understanding of this particular joke. I call it the mouse joke just because it's a little bit easier on the ears rather than the rape joke. But yes, so I think so I work with this joke for several pages. There's so much there, and all of it is very disturbing. I make connections to Pat Williams' work in Alchemy of Race and Rights, if some of you know that work, and her particular engagement with Tawana Brawley, a young girl who was raped in Central Park in New York City, and how one of the most prevailing images Williams has of Brawley is at the Apollo Theater laughing at a joke is made about her rape, and she and the spotlight shines on her and she opens her mouth and she laughs. So it's a very disturbing image. And I really wanted to also think, and something I do in the book, is that metaphoricity between Black and brown women and Black and brown women's relationship to violence and objection, and how their violence has emerged in particular cultural formations and political formations as laughable. And so what it meant for these women to actually think about what was that pleasure? I'll return to pleasure, right? What was that pleasure that had these women sitting in their 90s, rolling over, wiping tears from their eyes as they're laughing at what is fundamentally a rape joke? And so, you know, I lay out a few things that I'll point to. Is one, I do think the joke mocks masculinity in very specific ways. It mocks the kind of sentimentality of diasporic men who want to return to a fossilized homeland where sexuality is static and pure and unmoving and completely contained by a figure of the husband or the father. It also mocks the idea that, you know, women don't know sexuality until and unless a particularly authoritative male figure comes along and teaches it the act of sex to them, and that also within that act of sex that there is pleasure to be derived, right? It also, I think, mocks the idea that, or actually reveals, I think, exposes the idea that getting fucked, and I borrow the concept of fuckedness from Derek Scott, if you know his work in Extravagant Abjection, that fuckness constitutes a site of knowledge for women, and particularly young girls. So I wanted to also think about, again, this kind of assumption of innocence that actually women find quite laughable, you know, that these women are laughing not without the understanding that this young girl probably, more than likely, was raped, but more so what then emerges from that minefield of sexual violence and how that really upends and destabilizes ideas of feminine sexuality altogether. And that's really what the kind of work I wanted to do. So even the moving from that to this, the next speech act I moved to is one where they are thinking about a sister-in-law who, after giving birth to a daughter, loses her husband shortly thereafter. A few days later, her husband dies of a heart attack. And what circulated in that community was this phrase for Urdu Hindi speakers, "Beti baap ko kha gayi," which is the daughter ate the father. And so I again wanted to think about the mouth, a woman's mouth as a graveyard for men, as a graveyard for masculinity, that perhaps the power these women had wasn't this traditional sociological definition of agency, but more so that the power, their promiscuity was language. It was fundamentally their object. It was what they had to make sense of the violence. And what I'll say kind of more broadly outside of the context of the book, as someone now working on a project on brownness and femicide, is I think that we fundamentally lack grammar to think, really lack any kind of, strong grammars to think about violence against women, particularly sexual violence. We haven't developed those vocabularies because it's so uncomfortable. And I think, I think about the work of Shatima Threadcraft, Pat Williams. There's a number of scholars, particularly Black women scholars, who are thinking about Blackness and femicide in the US, particularly in the US context, that, it's like, what language do we use to describe women's loss vis-a-vis violence?
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. My name is Sumi Matuk. I wanted to actually ask you about the place of the epistemic in your work, because at various times you said this is epistemological, this is the epistemic framework, this is the archive, this is site of knowledge production in relation to the speech acts and the sort of the descriptions that you were providing. And I just want to I'm just curious to know, in terms of, given that the epistemology that you locate them in relation to analyzing what is going on refuses them actively. And I just wanted, and I found that quite interesting, because you preceded the talk by sort of saying, this is how these women, brown mothers, are kind of made absent, rendered absent in the epistemic terrain and in epistemology, and therefore, but what they are saying is epistemological. And I wondered how you circle that in relation to what is epistemological in terms of the resources that constitute epistemology in that context, given that epistemology that you have kind of traversed to get us there doesn't include these people. So then what in that sense? And I say this because and this is a kind of a problem across a range of lots of people have talked about this difficulty in thinking about the epistemological. Absolutely. And of course the turn away and the turn to the ontological is one of the ways in which people have tried to sort of think the ontological turn and so on. I mean, I'm not saying that that's the kind of route that one, I have difficulty with the ontological turn, but I just wondered, really in relation to the analytic, what does that do to the epistemic and the epistemological when the epistemological doesn't include you?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Is Sumi?
Yes.
Okay, well, we also too. Thank you. It's nice to meet you. Yes, I appreciate that question. So my initial turn towards epistemology, was coming out of kind of a Spivakian subaltern sense, where Spivak's fundamental, what I would say is one of the core arguments, is that the subaltern is not a subject position, but it's really about knowledge production. And knowledge production is entangled with class, and that class is also part of geopolitics. And so that's kind of my entryway into thinking about what it means to think about knowledge production, which we know knowledge production is very much tied to class and geopolitics and coloniality. So that was my entryway. The very early in the preface, I talk about what it means to deliberately subalternize my mother. This is the language that I use in the book, and why this might be a useful tool, a useful opening to deliberately subalternize the brown mother and specifically my mother, because I wanted to get at this kind of linguistic field through which these women were producing knowledge that was not seen as knowledge. And that knowledge produced about the maternal fundamentally and deliberately and perhaps arrogantly completely dismisses the figure of the brown mother. So that kind of meeting site between this deliberate disavowal, dismissal, detestation of the maternal, which often is not even the brown mother, and then to kind of bring that with Spivak's idea of class and knowledge production as integrally tied, and then to think about the lexical field in which these women were developing knowledge that they then transferred from generation to generation, that was a way in which they developed survival skills, practices of fertility, practices of fugitivity, and modes of being that were identified very specifically as irrational, as illegible, right, as not available or even interesting, Emrah, as you pointed to scholarly interpretation. So to kind of think about that meeting point between those three sites. So I think when I am using the frame epistemological, I'm really thinking in this kind of Spivakian sense, but really moving that into what we've seen in early, I would say 1980s, 1970s women of color feminisms, right? How do we think of Audre Lorde's writing about her mother in Zami, for example, that to not see that as an epistemology is such an injustice to the very idea of that which we might call knowledge.
Any other questions? Please go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Ratnadeep. I'm from SOAS. I was just curious in terms of like if you could speak about the act of like ululation and how that's connected to like brownness, like
The act of?
ululation, like when you know, like the act of like yeah, like how that ties to sort of the archive as well.
Do you mean like cadence and?
Yeah, like and the kind of the use of the tongue as like sort of a ritualistic, you know.
Yeah, it's interesting that you asked that question. I appreciate it. I had a dear friend who was an interlocutor at a bookstore in Montreal for my book, and one of the things she said to me, she said there's a rhythm in the book that emulates, as she read it, dyke sex. And so because you're thinking so much about the tongue, you can kind of think about this rhythm of the tongue, which is great. I loved it. I appreciated the metaphor. But I also thought this is interesting because I had another reader say to me that as they were reading the introduction, they felt like they were being in a cradle and being rocked back and forth. So there is something. I think some of that comes from my practice of writing, which relies very heavily on litany and repetition. Also a series of lists. So, I wanted to, really, I didn't want to write in the traditional academic form, even as I was deeply engaged, with these ideas that in which I have been trained. Whether it is Spivak or some of these other thinkers, obviously the whole kind of European crew. But I wanted to be able to engage with the work, but I didn't want to be trapped by that kind of grammar, that linguistic practice. I wanted to stay true to not necessarily a book that my mother could read, because my mother doesn't read. So on another note, I had a few mentors who would say, well, you're writing in a way that your mom's never going to read this book. And I said, but my mother doesn't read. So it's actually quite irrelevant, not to her or for her. She obviously knows I'm writing the book. She knows the book is now out in the world. But the book wasn't written necessarily for her, although I'm sure there's something interesting for her to know that this book is out in the world. But so I mean, I say this because I think this is about voice and you know, how we might think of writing, feminist writing. You know, what I'll also add here is a book is deliberately written in what we might consider to be a feminine tone. I wanted to write in a very feminine, what is might be considered feminine, which meant I literally had to put my mother's tongue in my mouth and make way for her kind of speech, which was litany, poetics, repetition, that which we might also think of as brown women's world making.
Any other questions? Maybe I can ask one.
Sure.
I mean, we all know about this whole history of psychoanalysis that actually considers motherhood as like the devil of the Oedipus complex, right? And I mean, in everyday life, in this kind of like in contemporary life, we also see how actually psychoanalysis, psychiatric institutions infuse these kind of ideas that pit, you know, daughters and sons against their mothers. Given that kind of this kind of powerful, you know, misogynistic kind of nature of psychoanalysis, how do you find your relationship with this
Body of
approach?
thought.
Yeah.
No, thank you.
You have mentioned greatly in your talk, but I'm like, curious about how you feel about this kind of field that actually.
Yeah, you know, and I had a lot of folks, you know, my mentors would say, you need just let go of psychoanalysis. Don't even engage with that. You know, like Freud is such a fucker, right? But and what I'll say about I've spent so much time with psychoanalysis. I took the 1 year. I almost actually went through the training for psychoanalysis, and then at some point, after about 2 years of the training, I thought, psychoanalysis is so uncomfortable with feminine sexuality. So a lot of the times when you're training for clinical practice, a lot of the examples that are used between the analyst and the analysand are examples of what, for example, a female patient would be wearing. So she was dressed, quote unquote, provocatively. These get embedded in the descriptions of the analyst about the patient. And in ways that appear to be just merely descriptive, but are also clearly part of the analytical space, but somewhat disavowed and somewhat described and kind of hovering in that space between, you know, above ground and underground. And I just, you know, I listened to so many lectures. I actually took 1 year course at BPI, which is the British Psychoanalytic Institute. That was interesting. You know, super old school. It's like, you know, the very proud of itself, BPI. But it's where I saw a lot of discomfort with, and I just thought, what is this discomfort? You know, you wouldn't see them describing, for example, what a male patient would be wearing. Torn jeans or, you know, I don't know, whatever, cut off tank top, I don't know. So male patients were never described. And often queer patients' bodies were also not described. But a cis feminine patient's body was always subject to description, written in the notes, and then subject as part of the analysis. So I just thought this is so interesting. What is this deep discomfort? And it's one of the reasons I ended up kind of, I mean, I knew that this was there. I didn't know how much it continued to shape contemporary psychoanalysis. I also think there's a dearth of Black and brown psychoanalysts in the field, and we've seen a lot of folks who write about, you know, most, for example, people of color who seek out psychoanalysis are often talking to white psychoanalysts. And psychoanalysis, this is the other thing, it often thinks that race is not at all part of subject formation. It's this exterior force that doesn't actually have to do with, you know, the psyche. Which is so bizarre. So yeah, there's so many problems with psychoanalysis, and many of which I hope I laid out. There's so much more in the book, but I didn't want to bore you to tears. But I will say, having said all of that, I do think there's still something really generative in the psychoanalytic parlance that allows us to think about the unconscious, that allows us to think about the fragmented psyche, that allows us to get at the kind of, again, the air of secrets, of the unconscious, of libidinal desires, that, and the idea that, again, one does not know oneself, which is the premise of psychoanalysis, that one does not know oneself. One will benefit from getting to know oneself if one can tolerate oneself once they actually get to know themselves. So I think this, again, I think this is probably the part of psychoanalysis that keeps bringing me back, this idea that we don't know ourselves fully, and that perhaps if we did, we might find ourselves very intolerable. Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Anjali. When you were just talking right now about like the psychoanalysis and how they assumed it, it just reminded me of something which is when I went to a psychiatrist, they gave me like a bunch of tests, and there was one that I responded, it looked like menstrual blood, but I said that in a really good way, like I liked the way it looked. And they misdiagnosed me with schizophrenia.
Well, of course, they had a field day with that.
And because they were like, you saw blood, that means you have violent thoughts. And it was insane. But then that also, like, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about, for me, like, there's a lot of relationship and a lot of like conversations that I've had with my mother that center around menstruation, either like conversations or the lack of conversations, both. But at the same time, where she did, I do remember a lot of times when she spoke about it as a place of rest, but also as a place of power, and also as a space of knowledge, where if you sat with it, you'd understand things.
Body knowledge.
I was just wondering, like, if you had anything to say about that.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Anjali, thank you. I actually don't talk about menstruation at all, probably in the book, or maybe just very, very briefly. And again, it was that kind of question, I think, that writerly aspect where you're like, how much do we give the reader? How much do we refuse to give? And so there were certain things that I just deliberately left out. But I think perhaps to engage with your question, rather than what I wrote in the book, I do think that this is one of the ways that we might think of embodied knowledge. This is also what, Sherry Moraga called theory in the flesh, right? That how, and again, we see this in Derek Scott's Fuckness, right? Like how knowledge that emerges from the experience of embodiment, from the kind of the viscerality, the sensation. Amber Jamila Musser's new book on sensation also really kind of gets at this, and she does it vis-a-vis, at least in one chapter, illness. My final chapter in this book discusses my mother's illnesses. It was one of the most difficult chapters to write. But I wanted to think of illness, particularly illness for my mother, but as a respite from patriarchy. It was one of the few times, or it was the route into breaking free of patriarchal expectations was to get sick. And so it very quickly, over time, became what I call a technology of life for her, whereas illness is often a technology of death. And I really wanted to think about this complex relationship between femininity and illness in the context of the brown domestic. And it was so difficult to write because I had to really, of course, the whole book I'm so close to embodiment and femininity in my mother's body, but in this particular chapter, I really had to get so close to what made me so uncomfortable, which was her ailing body, her diseased body. So, and I don't want to conflate menstruation with that at all, but I think, so let me very clearly say that that's not what I mean, but I think these become ways into the body that we often don't want to think about, right? And it's interesting, if we think about feminist genealogies, there was a time when menstrual blood was all over feminists, like 70s, right? In my 70s, maybe even early 80s. And then it's like, we just stopped talking about it. So, maybe the feminist bookstore is still, still see it there. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today, and thank you everyone for coming and sharing this space with us today. Dr. Charania will sign her books outside of the room, and yeah, have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone.